Alright folks, today I'm here to present to you another case of environmental storytelling in the Walking Dead universe. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this series by now, but just in case you're new here, environmental storytelling is a technique where a series of objects or bodies will be laid out in a way that conveys a story to the viewer without explicitly stating what that story is. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a closer look at a scene that's been heavily suggested in the comments section, the decaying CDC battlefield featured primarily in The Walking Dead Season 1, Episode 5. I'm going to structure this video by taking you through the story as it was first presented to us, before going back and attempting to piece together the evidence to figure out what happened here. These videos aren't meant to convince you I'm right or anything like that, just to keep conversations alive around smaller topics within this franchise. We'll probably never actually get answers to these questions anyway, so it's all just for fun in the end. If you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button and drop a sub to see more content like this. After a deadly attack at the quarry camp that took the lives of at least 15 the night before, Rick Grimes would advocate for the remaining survivors to head towards the Center for Disease Control within Atlanta. The idea had originally come from Morgan and Dwayne, who previously stated the authorities had directed civilians to refugee centers in the city with promises of solutions from the CDC before things went quiet. But despite the streets now being a cesspool for the dead and the hindsight knowledge of the Air Force firebombing the city, Rick still believed what was left of the army would have stopped at no cost to protect the facility given its value in this calamity. However, after arriving at the grounds as the sun begins to set, our survivors would be shocked to discover the remnants of a decaying battlefield before them. The main buildings still remained locked down, but in Shane's eyes, that was a result of nothing but automation, as across the pavement in front lies the bodies of both soldiers and civilians alike, long rotting in the Georgian sun as flies and maggots congregate around. The civilian corpses had clearly been put down with trauma to the head, which obviously makes sense given walkers were the enemy in this war zone. But what's interesting is that the soldiers share the same fate, which doesn't really make sense given, walkers don't shoot back. So obviously, the only explanations here are they had either taken their own lives when hope was lost, or had been shot by their fellow brothers in arms during the fight for one reason or another. To me, it looks as if this was a rather unorganized battle, as again, we see soldiers' bodies lying next to civilian corpses all over the field. My thought process is that the majority of the soldiers' bodies should be at the CDC's entrance, as they would have been pressed up to the door by the dead before their end given how slow they are. So clearly, something must have gone very wrong during the fight for so many servicemen to be lost before that point. My theory is this was the site of the military's final stand within Atlanta, which was rather unprepared following their failed campaign to take the downtown area back from the dead. At this point, the soldiers had been fighting for days in the streets to little success. They were exhausted, outnumbered, running out of ammo and supplies while losing allies to careless mistakes left and right. Needless to say, they weren't performing at their peak. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think mistakes caused by extreme fatigue could have been an initial cause for the dead's overpowering of the perimeter. However, this battle wasn't a complete failure on the military's part, as the CDC itself would never actually get breached by the dead. It was the people within that would break and cause its failure, as we meet the lone surviving scientist Dr. Jenner within, who gives us a couple details that may help us contextualize some aspects of the story. He states when things started to go bad, a lot of doctors simply opted out in the halls, but he specifies those who didn't bolted from the facility when the military got overrun outside. So, in my mind, that could mean as the remaining few soldiers were fighting for their lives trying to protect the facility, they suddenly would have had a bunch of scared doctors running into their line of fire on the battlefield. The people they were supposed to be defending. I know there could have been backdoors, but looking at later shots, it seems that the walkers really were coming from every direction, so I think they would have been screwed regardless. This would absolutely contribute to the army losing any chance of regaining control of the situation, as they would break ranks attempting to get them back to safety to no success. However, unfortunately, in the end, their sacrifice would essentially be for nothing, as the day would come where the Center for Disease Control would lose power and decontaminate itself by setting the air ablaze along with Dr. Jenner inside. And with that, the CDC, the decaying battlefield, and any hope of discovering a cure would burn away as our survivors flee into the wasteland once again. Now, this scene may not be as hard as some to piece together a story out of, but by far has it been one of the most fun for me. There's so many possibilities to imagine as to how a heavily militarized force loses to a slow and weak, yet plentiful enemy, but in order for my story to make sense, you need to really put yourself in the shoes of these soldiers. This battle would have taken place within a matter of days since Monument Day, so many of these brave fighters would have been facing the mental strain of killing what looked to have been regular living people during this time. That is, if they hadn't already been ordered to execute healthy civilians as well, like how we've seen before. I imagine they hadn't slept in days, had very few moments to eat or drink given the sheer number of walkers coming at them at any given time, and were facing the prospect of the Air Force dropping napalm on the city if they were to fail. And with this being their final stand in my interpretation, I bet their ammo was beginning to run pretty low. So by the time of the battle for the CDC, their tanks and artillery were essentially useless. Keep in mind, this level of chaos was happening in every city across the country, so what was deployed into Atlanta was it. There was no backup or supply drops coming. It was the remaining soldiers against the entire undead population of the city, and every round they shot just brought 10 times more their way. And if this battle took place at night, well, you can kiss most of your visibility goodbye as well, possibly providing an alternative explanation as to why so many soldiers were put down across the pavement. In the dark, everything is your enemy, so friendly fire could have been a real threat. Regardless, I'm now going to attempt to piece together a coherent story as to how this battle could have gone down, but again, I am just theorizing based on what I've noticed, so it's entirely possible I could misinterpret or miss some evidence altogether. But like always, this is where you guys come in. I'd love to hear what you believe happened here in the comments down below. The first few days after the wildfire virus went global could be considered one of the bloodiest times in human history. Millions were dying and turning by the hour, so the only solution the authorities could come up with at the time was to instruct civilians in neighboring rural areas to relocate to the cities, as they believed they would be easier to protect in a single area. But due to the local law enforcement's lack of knowledge on how the infections spread during this time, these refugee centers would be overrun as quickly as they were established. The perceived solution to this mistake was to allow the military to begin exterminating the infected by any means necessary, street by street, while the scientists within the Atlanta CDC scrambled to find solutions. But this would prove to be a much harder task than initially expected for those involved, as these creatures were nearly indistinguishable from the living at this point in the timeline, leading to many accidental casualties on all ends that would contribute to the strain on the soldiers' mental health. Although these mistakes wouldn't really matter in time anyway, as the higher authorities would eventually authorize the execution of non-infected civilians as well to contain the spread, leaving those with a conscience riddled with guilt even further. But despite their slow movement, the walkers were absolutely everywhere and quickly overwhelming the military. They would block the roads ahead while climbing onto their tanks and probably under their treads as well, causing most of the soldiers downtown to become stranded before eventually losing their lives as ammo ran thin. But the streets of Atlanta were secondary to the importance of defending the CDC, as despite many scientists taking their lives out of fear and fleeing while they still had the opportunity, others were putting their faith in the military by staying back and attempting to figure this mess out as long as they could. which would seem like the right decision at the time, as surviving squads from across the city would retreat to their base at the disease center after days of unsuccessful fighting as defenses were placed for a final stand. Terrified civilians would arrive, believing they could find sanctuary at the facility, much like Morgan had mentioned, but instead they would be shot on sight as ordered by the soldiers' higher-ups, again leaving them with an unclear head going into battle. They had pulled together all the remaining weaponry and ammunition left, praying it would be enough to fend off the hordes. But as the dead finally arrived from every angle, stumbling their way onto the battlefield by the hundreds, the soldiers would begin to face the consequences of exhaustion, mental strain, and dehydration. They simply couldn't organize themselves properly with this level of pressure and such little ammunition for their larger weaponry. Threats of napalm being used on the cities by the higher authorities given their failure would add to their mistakes, as those on the front lines would fail to confirm all walkers were successfully put down before shifting their focus, causing some to rise once again and bite the soldiers who were supposed to be defending the barriers before immediately getting put down by their fellow brothers in arms, weakening the perimeter as the dead flooded through. And as a result, bullets would begin flying from every end in a frantic, unorganized fashion that would only attract hundreds more from the surrounding area. And as the sun faded away, visibility would become low, leading to many unfortunate friendly fire casualties as the remaining soldiers would shoot at anything vaguely human-shaped in the dark. But ammo was running dry, and their allies were dropping at an unhandleable rate. Those who were separated from the others would find themselves surrounded by the masses with no hope for survival before turning the gun on themselves right there on the battlefield. But those who remained refused to give up and would fall back to the CDC's entrance in hopes of reorganizing themselves before all was lost. And they may have been successful too, if the doctors from within hadn't lost faith and bolted out the doors, causing the soldiers to break ranks as a result of the distractions while attempting to direct them back inside to no success. This would spell the end for the military within Atlanta, as any semblance of order would be lost. And although the doors to the CDC would be successfully locked down by Dr. Jenner within, the brave servicemen outside would lose their battle, whether it was from the walkers or by their own hand when hope was lost. And over the next 2 months, the dead surrounding the facility would disperse back into the city streets while the bodies left behind began to decay. However, those who weren't fully put down during the conflict would continue to linger around their site of death as if recalling their memories of combat. But like most things in this horrific world, the events of the battle at the CDC would eventually fade away to history as humanity faces the consequences of its loss for years to come. Alright, now, is this interpretation perfect? No, definitely not. The biggest issue with The Walking Dead as a whole is the idea the military could fail against a threat like this in the first place. When you see a tank left abandoned in the middle of a street with all its soldiers dead around, you wonder how that could have even been possible given how weak and slow the dead are. That's why I think it was essential to show more flashbacks to the outbreak in the early seasons. Seeing the mental state of these soldiers while the dead surround them from every angle would have really contextualized how this beat this. They sort of do that in Fear, but the soldiers are portrayed more as antagonists rather than protagonists in that first season. Frank Darabont's original plan for the Season 2 premiere was to experience the fall of Atlanta through the eyes of the soldier Rick finds in the tank at the end of Episode 1. And although you could argue that would really hurt the pacing of Season 2, I think it would have helped with the world building in the long run. It was never done because AMC cut the budget for the show, but if they did do it, I imagine we would have gotten a lot more information in regards to the battle at the CDC than just these couple scenes. Again, the dead don't shoot, and I can't imagine any raiders would be organized enough or have the balls to attack a military outpost. So these soldiers would have had to either pull the trigger on themselves or be put down by other soldiers one way or another for the scene to make sense. But that is the beauty of these videos. Sometimes you guys are able to see things I can't or come up with scenarios I never even considered. So this is where I pass the conversation off to you. Do you think my theory is accurate? Or do you think I'm way off base? I'd love to hear your interpretations in the comments down below based off all the evidence we've gathered. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.